Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, chapter 2 in your Bibles. Ruth chapter 2. We're looking at verses 8 through 13 this evening. Chapter 2 began with Naomi, the writer telling us information about Naomi. She had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, whose name was Boaz. There's the introduction to Boaz. And so we learn a little bit more about him as we have moved along here. The writer has told us that Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "May the Lord bless you," and their respect for him is reciprocated. "May the Lord bless you." He said to his servant, "Who is in charge and whose woman is this?" So he noticed something. The servant doesn't know anything. He doesn't know her name. He simply said, "This is what she told me. She is a young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab, and she said, 'Please let me glean after the reapers among the sheaves.'" That's in verse 7. So she's been reaping for a while, and she's only rested, evidently recently. So now in verses 8 through 13, the moment of truth has come. Dun, dun, dun. Boaz and Ruth are face to face. Now, how is he going to respond? Is he going to respond to a foreigner? Is he going to be a bigot to her? And is he going to avoid her as much as possible? Is he going to rebuke her for coming to the field alone? And you have to pretend you don't know at this point. We don't know what he's going to do. How is he going to respond to her? In reality, he responds very well. In fact, he proves to be worthy of the reputation that he owned. Back in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, 'Please let me go to a field and glean.'" It says here, "and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." Well, that she does find favor in this field with this man Boaz. She certainly does. There's another verse I was looking for, and I don't see it right offhand real quick here. But Boaz responds consistent with the reputation that he owned. And the words that came from him are saturated with compassion, with grace, and generosity. He proves to be here a living example of God's loving kindness, of God's hesed among men. So verses 8 and 9, let's read those, and then we'll talk about what they say. "Then Boaz," this is after verse 7, "she came to him and remained from the morning until now. She's been sitting here in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw.'" Stop right there. We'll just make some comments on those two verses. Well, coming to her, he wants her to pay careful attention. And so he says, "Listen carefully, my daughter." Literally, the words are, "Have you not heard?" And often the Hebrew will use negative questions in a way to express strong affirmations. So he's saying, in English, we could understand it, "Listen carefully, my daughter," is what he's saying. Using the interrogative as a question. You guys know that. You're all homeschooled, right? You're not products of public school, so you know what an interrogative is. It's a question. Well, as it turns out, as we study the book of Ruth, Boaz and Naomi use the interrogative, or the writer applies the interrogative forms to them and them only, never to Ruth, but always to Boaz and Naomi. One commentator noted that because you see this in here, may indicate that Naomi and Boaz are closer in age, or of the same generation than Ruth and Boaz are. And we're going to see here as we go through here, there's no doubt Boaz is a bit older than Ruth here. That's one observation that I made in studying. You'll see this. So he wants her to pay careful attention, and he calls her my daughter, which is remarkable because it is how Naomi saw Ruth. In chapter 1, verse 11 and verse 12, Naomi refers to Ruth as my daughter as well. And chapter 2 and verse 2, Naomi responded to Ruth, and she said to her about gleaning in the fields, "Go, my daughter." So it's remarkable that he would say this, but also because of Boaz's intention to break down the barriers that separate the two. So he immediately broke down a lot of barriers when he said, "Listen carefully, my daughter." Wow, that's pretty remarkable. In chapter 3, verse 10, we read this. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether rich or poor." Also, verse 11. "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask." So 2 other times he refers to her as his daughter. So it is quite remarkable that he refers to her that way, and there are barriers there that separate the two that are eliminated because of that. It's a term of endearment, a term of compassion. And the expression is not patronizing, but reflects the age difference, and it stems from the genuine sense of responsibility that he feels for Ruth. He's been made aware that, or he's heard through the grapevine that she came back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and that has impressed him. So there's a genuine sense of responsibility that he feels for her. He knows that she is a Moabite, yet he offers her, this foreigner, his protection and his resources. And the formal part of the speech in verses 8 and 9 consists of 4 basic statements. 1, Ruth is not to go and glean in any other field. She has no need to go beyond the limits of Boaz's field at all. That's what he says to her. And this is necessary that he tell her this, since the fields in the ancient Near East were not clearly separated by visible boundaries. And the words "do not" there are emphatic. And since Boaz is granting her more than ordinary rights of gleaning, which we'll talk about in just a moment, she must not inadvertently glean in some other field, because an owner of another field has not given her those unusual rights to do things. So it's important that she stay in this. And what you see in verse 8, do not go to another, do not go. And then verse 9, go after. Those are the same words. If you see in verse 8, he says, do not go to another. And verse 9, let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after. Do not go to another and go after. Those are opposite. It's a play on words in the Hebrew, using the same 2 Hebrew words. And what it does is it sharpens the contrast between the 2 alternatives that Boaz presents to Ruth. On the one hand, do not go after another field. On the other hand, go after them. On the field, follow my maids and follow them. Go after them. So if we could read Hebrew, we would see a play on words which the writer intended to grasp the attention of the reader. That was his intention in doing this. The word for maids that he says there in verse 8, but stay with my maids, the last word in verse 8, that word formerly described Ruth as a widow. Back in verse 6 of chapter 2, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land. This young, right here, is the word maid. So this maid here describes Ruth as a widow back in verse 6. The word most commonly refers to a young woman of marriageable age. So he's telling her to follow the maids. Follow those people that are about your same age. Stick with them. Don't leave them. Specifically, Ruth is to Keep your eyes on the field which they, that's all the harvesters, reap, and go after them, that is the maids. Follow them. That's what he's telling her to do. So, first of all, you're not to glean in any other field. And, I skipped a little part here. That's the first thing that he tells us to do, 4 basic statements. The second basic statement, he says that you are to attach or cling to Boaz's regular maids. I'm sorry, if that didn't make sense, that's because I skipped a couple of lines. Forgive me. I'll go back and cover this. The second thing Boaz tells her is that you are to attach, you are to stick yourself, you are to cling yourself to Boaz's regular female servants or her maids. That's the last word in verse 8. Okay? That word for maids describes Ruth as a widow in verse 6. So that's what he's telling her to do. That's the second thing. The third thing he tells her to do is not to worry about harassment from the male workers. The word servant in verse 9, let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants. The word servants there is masculine. You wouldn't know it looking at the English, but the word the servants is masculine. So Ruth is not to worry about harassment from the male workers, translated servants in verse 9. You're going to be alongside the maids that are my maids, and they're going to offer you protection from possible harassment. So when Boaz says, I have commanded, he's not referring to a previous action. He's giving her instructions to do now. You may have done some things the first part of the day. Now you're resting. From now on, here's what I want you to do. So when he says, I have commanded, he's not referring to previous action. He did not know Ruth was there until he arrived. Nor does the statement refer to his command in verse 15. The command in 15 that he gives to her is this. Boaz commanded his servants, let her glean even among the sheaves. That's going to come later. So as this thing progresses, he gives her greater freedom to do some things to gather food. So this thing that we see here in verse 9, I've commanded, is not referring to previous action, and the statement does not refer to his command in verse 15. The verbs are different, and there is a time gap between verses 13 and 14. We're going to work our way all the way up to verse 13, and then there's going to be a little bit of a time gap. So perhaps she's gleaning, and maybe she follows this procedure, this instruction for a few days perhaps, but there's going to come a time when he gives her greater freedom to gather food at a later time. How much later? There's an undetermined amount of time between verses 13 and 14. We'll see that. A translation here might be something like, I am herewith ordering, or surely I am commanding. That is the idea that we see in verse 9. I have commanded the servants not to touch you. The word touch, what do you mean by touch? Are we talking about possible rape? Or are we talking about just harassment or something? Well, the word touch can mean to strike violently or to injure. Genesis 32 is an example of that. Or primarily to trouble, to interfere with, and that would include molest. And 2 Samuel chapter 4 and Jeremiah chapter 12 are a couple of examples of that. The latter sense of harass, mistreat, or take advantage of is the best way that we should understand the word here. With such unusual permission, especially to a foreigner, a Moabite woman, Ruth is to be careful to stay in Boaz's field as he commands his workers not to harass or mistreat her. Okay? It would be... I can't think of, it would be, think of high school. You high school and you're faithful to your high school, your colors, and everything, and then you have another team that comes in and they start sharing things. They start doing things, the same thing you're doing, and there might be some competition there. It might break out into a little bit more aggression and a fight or something like that, because who are you? You're not supposed to be here. You're a foreigner. You're not of Israel. Those kinds of things. That's what he's telling his people. Don't harass her. Don't pester her. Don't bother her. He's telling them not to mistreat her. Presumably, there would be others gleaning who are Israelites, and potentially they could get territorial in their actions as well. We've gleaned here for the last 2 years, and here is this foreigner, a young Moabite woman in our territory where we used to glean. Everybody knows I glean around this section right here. Who is she? And so they start getting territorial. I'm sure you could easily see how that would happen. Very easily. See how that would happen. She is afforded protection, thus from his own workers and others who may be gleaning. He covers both of those in his instructions there. So Boaz certainly unintentionally instituted the first sexual harassment policy in the workplace. And it's in the Bible. Fourth, first of all, don't glean in any other field. Second, you are to attach yourself to my maids. Third, don't worry about harassment from male workers. Fourth, Ruth may drink freely of the water that is provided for Boaz's regular field workers. That's what he says in the latter part of verse 9. She had the same status and privileges as one of his workers, which I would suggest to you is almost unheard of. So he does need to make the statement. Otherwise, very likely, people would not respond well to her doing these things. We'd have to jump into their sandals, so to speak, to understand the culture of the time, to appreciate it to its fullest. But she did have the same status and privileges as one of his workers. In a cultural context in which normally foreigners would draw for Israelites and women would draw water for men, an example would be Genesis 24 and 10 and following, Boaz's authorization of Ruth to drink from water his men had drawn is extraordinary. Wow. One might even say, you might, in your good intentions, may be putting her in a position where she is going to get hurt. She's going to get verbally lashed by somebody because you're giving her so much that somebody's going to fire back at her. Nevertheless, that's not the writer's intention. The writer's intention is to show the loving kindness of Boaz toward her. But he has done this for her. Now, and even these people could even reflect back, because stories were handed down verbally in this day. There were no Xerox copiers, and they didn't have copies of the law, a lot of them anyway. So people would hand stories down by generation to generation. They'd sit around the fire, sit around the house, and they'd tell stories of what God has done for them. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, this is Moses speaking to the people of Israel just before they go into the land. And it says in Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, "No Amorite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you." So there's that memory that the people would have of how the Moabite people treated them coming out of Egypt. Good to see you. So you have an earlier scene with the Moabites was the opposite. Now here you have a woman here who's a widow amongst all of them, and she's given the privileges to drink water that's been from the same place that men draw from. Several modern commentators add that in distancing Ruth from other males, Boaz subtly discloses his own romantic agenda. And you're going to have those. That's why there is the kind of discussions that we have in Ruth chapter 2 is because a lot of people do see this. Rabbinic sources, what they do with this scene right here is they highlight Boaz's gallantry, which is more likely the intention of the text, is to show forth the loving kindness, the character of Boaz that wins Ruth's heart. But not everybody agrees with this. Other writers, Jewish writers, the Targum, for example, has Boaz ask her not to go to another nation. And the comments on the Targum, which is called the Midrash, has Boaz respond to her modesty and lack of greed. And others write that Boaz urges her to remain in his field, not because he desires her company, but because he is concerned over her provision and safety. So you see, there are different writers that would throw certain slants on this because of that word touch, is what they would say. Well, after Boaz says this to her, she is just floored. Modern idiomatic term. It floored her. She cannot believe what she just heard. So verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" That's her response. Ruth's response here reflects the totally unexpected generosity from Boaz. She had not expected this. This comes to her out of the blue, so to speak. In fact, Ruth's response is an act usually reserved for deity and royalty. Ruth found that for which she had been searching. Remember chapter 2 and verse 2 we read earlier? She said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." She found it right there. Perhaps she's thinking, perhaps that's part of the reason she's so beside herself here. I cannot believe that I have found favor with you. This is the very thing that I was searching for. So she dropped to her knees and touched her forehead to the ground. She fell on her face. That's what it means. Dropped to her knees and put her forehead to the ground. The gesture illustrates the biblical understanding of worship. We have the word here occurs only in the book of Ruth right here. Obviously, the gesture was performed in less significant contexts, such as greeting, or it's a mark of respect in Genesis 23, or an expression of gratitude in Genesis 48. But the external sign is an indicator of the inner spirit. This is my gratitude expressing itself in putting my face to the ground. But it is a gesture that illustrates the biblical understanding of worship. She asked him why he was being so kind to her in verse 10. Her action and accompanying words show that she is very surprised at what Boaz has said to her, showing that he must have granted her far more than she had requested. To find favor in the eyes of means to be the recipient or the object of one's kindness. And it's a wonderful phrase to use in your prayers as you're praying for your children, perhaps. I pray for my son, that the Lord would put John favorably in the eyes of his chain of command. What I'm asking for is that their heart would be inclined to show kindness and grant requests from him. That's what I'm praying for. And to find favor in the eyes of simply means to be the recipient of one's kindness. The kindness extended is offered freely and without obligation, but this kind of kindness can be prompted by the recipient's character or actions, which is what we see here. She responds this way because of what he says to her, the way he's treated her. And it was certainly true in Ruth's case. As Boaz explained, he had a full report of Ruth's devotion to Naomi. And since she is a foreigner and she is sensitive to that. Now, was it the case where many people had sniggered under their breath, and she'd heard them talking off in the corner somewhere? There's that Moabite woman. There's that foreigner. Here comes the foreigner. Maybe has she heard that? And she knew about this. She appears to be sensitive about her alien status because she mentions in verse 10, since I am a foreigner. And finds it a bit difficult to believe that Boaz is indifferent to her being a Moabite. Ruth calls attention to her outsider status, and when she does that, she compels Boaz to address this point when he responds to her question. He's going to respond to her question in verses 11 and 12. Why have you treated me this way since I am a foreigner? That's a question. Boaz is going to respond in verses 11 and 12 to that. So in light of chapter 4 and verse 10, where Boaz identifies Ruth as the wife of Mahlon, it's important to note that there is no indication in this passage that she has right here the status of Mahlon. Right now, he just looks at her as a young foreign woman who has done a great act, a great sacrifice in following her mother-in-law back to a land where she does not know and has no family here. So how does Boaz respond to her? Verse 11 and 12. Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Wow. That's his response to her. He heard about the actions that she had done. He heard about her. That's what prompted his kindness. That won his heart. His kindness is going to win her heart, but to begin with, her act of sacrifice won his heart. You have to admire what she did. It's very admirable. So Boaz now answers her question, what he does in verse 11 and 12. Although his foreman had not identified her by name, as soon as he identified her by status, being a Moabitess, and the affiliation, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, the lights went on, so to speak. You're the one I've heard about. That's the one. Now he's connecting all the dots. She is the one he had heard about. The emphasis is not on the certainty of facts about Ruth, but on the extent of information that he had received. And the details include her extraordinary kindness to her mother-in-law and her extraordinary courage in accompanying her back. And that's the first part of verse 11. And then the second part of verse 11, the New American Standard inserts the word and, the conjunction and. Do you see that? Verse 11, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left. That and right there obscures the relationship totally. The and really shouldn't be there. Perhaps if you have a different translation, it's not there. The conjunction and there is giving further information, not two pieces of separate information necessarily. Giving further information. It's not two sets or pieces of information. And the NIV translates it this way. The death of your husband, how you left your father and mother. Not and how you left your father and mother. Those kinds of things. So having been released from all the legal and the moral obligations toward Naomi, Ruth did the radical, unexpected thing. She clung to Naomi. She preferred the unknown world of her mother-in-law, like Abraham before. Unlike Abraham before, who had a divine promise. Remember? Leave everything and go to a land that I'm going to give you. Remember that? Well, Ruth left everything to a land that she had never been to, but Abraham had a promise. Genesis 12. Ruth left without any promised security and with every prospect of a future life of poverty and alienation. She had no idea that she would actually give birth to the great-grandfather or grandfather of David. It was quite remarkable what she did. So as people who ascribe improper or kindness in turn kind of motivations on Boaz is unfounded. Boaz is not returning the favor necessarily. Boaz is not suggesting anything improper. By all indications, he is a good man. A good man. A man of great wealth, the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz in chapter 2 and verse 1. He truly embodies the character of covenant faithfulness. And furthermore, in Boaz's response, we must recognize the providence of God. In chapter 2, verse 2, Ruth humbly requests to glean behind someone in whose eyes she may find favor. God heard her wish and prepared the heart of Boaz to meet her. In verse 12, Boaz, in fact, shows God's work in his heart. Going beyond answering Ruth's question, he calls upon God to intervene on her behalf. Wow. He first prays that God would reward Ruth for her actions. This is illustrated in Proverbs 19 and verse 17. It says, "He who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed." That's the spirit, the attitude in which Boaz responded to Ruth. So he prays that God would reward her for her actions. Now, Boaz is not politely dismissing his responsibility to an alien. He's not saying, like we did this morning, "May the Lord be with you and bless you and go warm and be filled and be comforted," and then you walk off. He's not dismissing his responsibility. His presupposition and recognition is that God maintains order by repaying people according to their deeds. That's clear in the Old Testament. Part of the Mosaic covenant. He knows this. He's putting her in God's hands. In general, this involves punishment for sin, of course, but for Israel, it involves specifically retribution for violating the covenant standards. And that principle does. And biblical writers also know of God's repaying people for good deeds. Very much so. 1 Samuel chapter 24 and Proverbs 13:21 and Proverbs 25 verse 22 are examples of that. Now, we know. Boaz will be the one that God uses to provide for Ruth. But we don't know that yet, right? Okay? We don't know that yet. Boaz doesn't know this yet. But Boaz's prayer is going to be answered by God, and Boaz is going to be the very instrument that God uses to provide what Boaz prayed that God would give her. Continuing the economic metaphor here, Boaz asks that her wages from the Lord be full. There in verse 12. And that word only occurs in Genesis 29 and Genesis 31. It refers to the wages that Laban owed Jacob. In that context, Jacob relied on the justice of God to repay him in spite of Laban's deceitfulness. This that prayer there that Jacob prays, that relieves Jacob of revengeful schemes, and it brings a peaceful attitude to him. In other words, Jacob put it in God, this is in your hands. Remember his deceitfulness. That is, it's in your lap, Lord. You do with it in your own time, in your own way. That gives me a sense of peace. I'm not going to be vengeful. I'm not going to be holding grudges or anything else. It's in God's hands. I'm confident that he will deal with Laban in his time. So by praying that relieves of his revengeful schemes, and it brings a peaceful attitude, expecting justice. Here, Boaz recognizes the magnitude of Ruth's actions and calls on God to reward her in full. Boaz may be asking that Ruth be given a husband and children as reward for her commitment to Naomi. Maybe. We don't know yet. The allegiance Ruth had shown is not merely to Naomi, but to the God of Naomi's people, the God of Israel. So the expression of this is, quote from one commentator here, one of the most beautiful pictures of divine care in all of Scripture. What he says to her. We could adopt this in our prayers for those whom may be closest to us. When he says in verse 12, may the Lord reward your work and your wages. May they be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Some form of that. Could adopt that in our own prayers. Protection is depicted by the wings, commonly applied to ancient Near East gods as well as to the God of Israel. You have sought refuge, under whose wings you have sought refuge. Ruth had come to seek refuge under the wings of Yahweh, the God of Israel, transferring allegiance from Chemosh, the God of the Moabites, to the true God, Yahweh of Israel. Ironically, as we know, God's wings will come in the form of Boaz. Verse 12 points ahead to how that protection would be practically expressed. And in Ruth, in chapter 3, verse 9, he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. So in that passage there in chapter 3, verse 9, Ruth possibly recalling Boaz's wording back in verse 12, back in chapter 2, verse 12. Possibly repeating his words or the meaning of his words back to him, would ask for protection through marriage under Boaz's covering. He who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him. Very important lesson that we could learn from this. Then she said, verse 13, her response. Then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. And then you can see, verse 14, at mealtime Boaz said to her, there's an undisclosed amount of time that elapses between verses 13 and 14. What she says to him, she responds much as she did in verse 10, in the same way, much in the same way as verse 10. This is an expression of thanksgiving or of thank you, something like, you are most gracious, sir. She's found favor among her new people. She expresses two reasons for her gratitude here. First of all, for calming her emotionally. She says, you have comforted me. Just as Joseph reassured his brothers in Genesis 50, his words brought peace of mind and encouragement. A destitute foreigner who had gone out to glean, not knowing what will happen, found God's loving kindness in Boaz. This kind of comfort depicts a mother and her child in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 13. It also depicts God's restoration of Israel in Isaiah chapter 40 and verses 1 and 2. Isaiah 41 and 2, it's a passage I'm sure you'll recognize. It says this. Of course, it never opens to 41 and 2. Comfort, there it is right there. You see in verse 13, I have found favor in your sight, for you have comforted me. Isaiah 40, comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem. Call her out that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received the Lord's hand, double for all her sins. And as noted, as I mentioned, it's a word that indicates or depicts comfort between a mother and her child in Isaiah 66 and verse 13. That's the first thing, for calming her emotionally, you have comforted me. Second, for his kind words. Indeed, you have spoken kindly, she says. That's compassionately and sympathetically. This phrase is the language of courtship. Judges chapter 19 and verse 3, Genesis 34 and verse 3. However, though it is the language of courtship, and those you see the examples there, Judges 19. In fact, let me read that, and you'll get the idea. Judges 19 of what I mean by courtship. Judges 19, verse 3. Then her husband arose and went after her. This is a husband whose wife had ran off, and he's going back after her. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak tenderly to her in order to bring her back. You see that? Speak tenderly to her in order to bring her back. That's Ruth. You have comforted me and indeed have spoke kindly to your maidservant. Do you see the similarity in language? In English, that's because there are similar words in Hebrew. And Genesis 34 and verse 3, you see another example like that. So the phrase is the language of courtship. However, a romantic connotation is nowhere in sight here. In Judges 19, you have clearly a husband going after his wife to win her back home. And in Genesis 34, you have the same kind of thing. I believe it's has to do with Diana, I think. Genesis 34 and verse 3. He was, that is Hamor, Shechem, the son of Hamor, the prince of the land, saw her. He took her and lay with her by force. Now, he raped one of Jacob's daughters. And then it says, he was deeply attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. That spoke tenderly to her is the reason why we say that's the language of courtship. Well, Ruth says, you have spoken tenderly to me. So people sometimes go, okay, well, we're starting to move in that direction. But there's nothing in the context here that would indicate romantic inclinations. In Genesis 34, it's very clear. In Judges 19, it's very clear, but it's not here. So the phrase there carries the meaning encourage or reassure that you do have in Genesis 50 and 2 Samuel 19. You have these same phrases that mean encourage and reassure. So like God, Boaz was no respecter of persons here. He had crossed racial and now class distinctions. He's simply speaking encouraging and reassuring words to her. I don't think it's until chapter 3 where he starts to go, this girl really likes me. Until then, there's nothing here. You'd have to read chapter 3 back into chapter 2. And of course, you cannot do that. Proper hermeneutics does, you cannot take something in the New Testament, for example, and read it back into the Old. The Old Testament stands on its own. The New Testament does not reinterpret the Old. Ruth calls herself a maidservant. Usually that word is used when the female slave is viewed as a possession and a laborer who belongs to the lowest rung of the social ladder. That's what she refers herself as. Such ranking women in society could be given as a gift to accompany a bride, like so-and-so married so-and-so, and she took her maids with her. That's how she describes herself, as one of those maids that go along with the bride. That's what she's saying here. Ruth's humility is seen in the attitude of herself, even too low for the meaning of the word itself. And this is expressed as, though I am not like one of your maidservants. I'm not even on the same level as those maids that go along with somebody who gets married. Even though I am not like one of those maids. So she puts herself at the very bottom of the social pecking order. And the whole expression, get this, the whole expression should be understood as a future. Though I shall never be like, or though I shall never be equal to your servants. So in verse 13, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, even though I shall never be like one of your maidservants. Quite a statement from her. So Ruth's character has now left Naomi in chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, and Ruth in chapter 2, verse 13 here, speechless. Remember, Ruth said, I'm going where you're going. Where you die, I'll die. Your God will be my God, and I'm going to stay with you. Naomi didn't say anything. Okay, this girl's made up her mind. Turn around, continue the march to Israel. Here, it ends. Her statement evidently garners no respect or no response from Boaz. They both, Naomi and Boaz, find her commitment to do right unique in Israel. She finds Boaz's response amazing, especially in the face of race and class differences. And that's where this conversation ends. Between verses 13 and 14, there's an unknown interval of time. And the verse begins, then Boaz said to her at mealtime, and that's an invitation to join him for dinner. Yikes. It even gets, there's more privileges, more freedoms that he is granting her incrementally. So he invites her to sit with him, perhaps to be in the same room, perhaps to be at the same table. We'll have to see what all this implies here. And by the way, did people eat in the Old Testament to satisfy hungry stomachs? Is that the reason they ate? Or did they eat because of symbolic significance? Or was it a little bit of both? That we need to entertain next week as well. Any questions? I hope this is encouraging. I hope it's fascinating to read this and to study it, to understand as best we can all the things that they're saying. We're separated by a vastly different culture, a vastly different language, and so the English doesn't always capture all of the little colorful things that are going on here, and that's what we're trying to do, is capture all of this and understand this not just in black and white, but in full color. No questions? Okay, well, next week we will pick up with verse 14 and get as far as we can in the study of Ruth. I hope this has been a blessing to you. Men, we can learn from this kind of character in treating and speaking kindly to our children and to our wives. People are prejudiced. People are racist. There are certain people that are racist, and you see an example. God is not a racist. He has no issue. Everybody's created in the likeness and image of God. Everyone. every human being. So he's not a respecter of persons, and that is something that we should take note of and practice as well in our own life. Lord God, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for allowing us this time.